Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll just give it a few minutes to let people come in from the waiting room. Hi, thank you for joining us. We're just giving it time for people to drip in from the waiting room. Okay, I think people are still coming in. I'll just wait a few more minutes. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I will start the session now, and then as people join, hopefully they can follow along. So my name is Amelia, and I'm really delighted to be hosting today's session, which is being organised by the Disabled Leaders Network. So before we get started, I'll just go over some access elements. So hopefully you're aware we have BSL interpreters on the call. So if you need to use BSL, they should be pinned for you. And hopefully you're seeing them now. Just a note that it does tend to work better on a laptop, and you tend to have more kind of options for how you can view the interpreters on a laptop. So we would recommend accessing this session from a laptop instead of a tablet or phone, if possible, if you want to utilize the BSL. We also have captions for this call, which you should be able to find the link to those in the chat, which you can access there. But please do use the chat to let us know if you have any access issues or anything isn't working for you, and we'll do our best to try and help. In general, today's session is a webinar style format. So that means if you're in the audience, we can't see or hear you. So you can relax and you can get yourself comfortable, and hopefully you'll enjoy listening to and watching the session. But we very much do want to hear from you and hear your views and thoughts and questions. So please do use the chat to add any comments, thoughts, and then please do use the Q&A function to ask any questions. So that will be at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button that says Q&A, and that's where you can ask questions to our panelists. So I think that's kind of the main access things out of the way. But as I say, please do let us know anything in the chat. So as I say, my name is Amelia, and I am a 20-something white woman wearing a lilac roll neck, sitting in front of a bookshelf with some books. Yeah, I will be hosting today's session. So today's session is focused on policy, and particularly as it pertains to disability. So we'll be talking about how to pursue a career in policy, as well as different policy areas that our panelists are working on that will really affect disabled people, and kind of what that means, how it works behind the scenes to work on policy, as well as the kind of ways that you can influence policy in terms of government consultations and green papers. So with that all being said, I will hand over to our first speaker, Robert McLaren from the think tank Policy Connect, who will tell us a little bit more.
Thanks, Amelia, and hello, everyone. Quick visual description of me. I'm a white man in my 30s wearing a light-coloured shirt and a sweater over the top of that, a blurred background. So yeah, I'm really pleased to join you all today alongside my colleagues, Clive and Dennis, who you'll hear from a bit later. What I wanted to do was introduce Policy Connect and talk a little bit about my own journey into public policy as a field, and then as a sort of an exercise to give some insight into how we do public policy in a think tank setting, I wanted to talk about the government's current consultation on the future of the Access to Work programme. And I know some people joining have already started to look at that consultation. So it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on how you think you might respond to the questions the government's put. So to start with, Policy Connect, as I say, is a think tank, which means that all we do is policy. Most people, I think, who work in public policy are not working for organizations that only do policy. They tend to be working for other organizations in a policy function. So, a charity is likely to have a policy officer or more than one. Many businesses have public affairs staff who play a similar role, trade organizations, and so on and so on. Universities have policy experts. In the same way that many organizations will have a communications department, but then you also have communications agencies. So in some ways, a think tank is a little bit like that, but for policy. Where a think tank is somewhat different to a public affairs or lobbying organization is that we don't act on behalf of clients. We do receive sponsorship for reports, for events, and so on. But those we're not commissioned to carry out the work, and we retain editorial control, meaning the views that we express are our own views, not simply a representation of views of a client, which would be a public affairs approach. And of course, think tanks are independent of government. They tend to be not-for-profits. I'm not aware of any of them that are for profit. Some of them are charities. We're not for profit. I also think that I sometimes think of think tanks on a spectrum a little bit between some that are sort of highly academic and some that are a bit more kind of politics and influencing orientated. So when I think about ones that are really highly academic, I think of, for example, kind of economics-based think tanks, or some kind of international affairs or military affairs think tanks. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, they tend to be carrying out work that is a lot like the kind of economic analysis that a university might do. Whereas there are other think tanks that you tend to see, responding to political events, getting involved in a bit more of the kind of cut and thrust of politics, that we're slightly more toward that latter end. Within that latter type of think tank, some think tanks have a party political affiliation, or at least a ideological affiliation. So centre-right think tanks might include the Institute for Policy Studies, I think it's called, or Policy Exchange, let's say. And a centre-left think tank might be the Institute for Public Policy Research. And then there are cross-party think tanks, or kind of non-aligned think tanks, of which Policy Connect would be an example. So would, for example, Demos. Okay, so people will perhaps have questions about some of that. So do add them to the chat, and we can kind of get back to the question of what are think tanks and how do they work. So yeah, let me say something about how I started to work in this field. I suppose I have to start really with my sort of background and education as it relates to disability policy. So I'm dyslexic. I'm quite severely dyslexic, and my big ambition when I left school was never to go back to anything like that again. I eventually capitulated and did go to university as a mature student a bit later on into my 20s. And I was helped by the Disabled Students Allowance, which I'm sure many people on the call today have experienced. And when I was at university, there were some proposed and then eventually effected cuts to the Disabled Students Allowance. So that helped spark my interest in policy. I was also studying philosophy, and I liked the idea of sort of analyzing arguments and thinking about the sort of clearest way to express ideas and so on. And between those two things, I got to thinking that maybe public policy was some way that I could exercise the same kind of intellectual muscles that I was enjoying in the context of philosophy, but have a bit more of a direct impact on the world. And I was particularly interested in accessibility policy, and particularly in disability policy, and but within that, particularly interested in the role of technology in supporting neurodivergent and disabled people. I didn't think that I would be lucky enough to actually work on exactly that area as I have been, because I thought that's too niche. Nobody's going to employ you to do that. But maybe I could work in education policy or tech policy or something like that. So when I finished my undergrad, I thought, what are the different routes into policy? I didn't have any relevant experience. I didn't have any experience of even working in an office environment. And in fact, I was quite intimidated by the idea of working in an office because of dyslexia. And so I kind of played around with a few different options, and I also sought out various mentors and people who might be able to advise me. And one of the things I found is that people were really generous with their time and interested in helping somebody out. And I think that one can sometimes be too shy about that. I know now from working in policy that it's really something that I enjoy, and I'm always pleased when people want to get into the same field that I'm in. I think it's cool. So of course I'm going to be encouraged by somebody who is inspiring in the same direction. So it's not an imposition or a burden when you ask people in the field, look, I'm interested in this area. How can I get into it? Especially if you show that you're prepared to take on board what they say and try things out. So I thought, okay, what about doing a master's degree in public policy, as I'm sure some people on the call are doing? And my thought for that was, well, I did enjoy university in the end, but it was pretty tough, and I wasn't super keen to immediately go back, incur the debt. I also thought, well, maybe I'll give myself a year or two to try out other options, and I could always go back to do a master's degree later. There were some of my mentors who did advise me to take a master's degree, and I know that it's a route that's been really helpful for many people. In fact, I think I'm probably one of the few people at Policy Connect who doesn't have any further study, but hopefully that shows that it's not 100% necessary either. I thought about internships. I saw those on other people's CVs, but I was intimidated by the idea of going into an office environment for 3 months. I thought people would just sort of chuck written work at me and I wouldn't be able to handle it. Again, maybe I dismissed that too quickly, and I know other people have found a lot of success with internships. My colleague Clive Gilbert, who'll speak later, undertook some internships, but I was a bit scared off them. What I did pursue was trying to add policy to existing work that I was doing. So after university, I began working in the area of disability and technology, doing the same technology training that I had received as a student as the trainer. So as part of the Disabled Students Allowance, I was teaching people to use the technology. I was teaching people to use the technology in their workplace as part of access to work. And as part of that, I worked with various different organizations. And I thought, well, if I just volunteer to help them do some policy work, they're probably going to say yes. So I would say, look, there's this government consultation about Disabled Students Allowance. Why don't you, as a organization in the sector, respond to it? And look, I'll write the response for you, and you can obviously review it. And a couple of people went for that. So that kind of gave me a bit of experience. I also tried to join various kind of boards and working groups and initiatives within that sector, because again, those are often kind of concerned with public policy. They write letters and also respond to consultations and the like, and they think about, the regulation of that field. And that also helps with networking. As I say, I think one shouldn't be shy about just talking to people and saying this is something I'm aspiring to do. But to some extent, it's even better if you can also say, here is something that I'm currently working on or that I'm currently interested in. And finally, I also found opportunities to write publicly about the area of public policy that I was interested in. So on various online magazines, for example, there's one that deals with higher education policy. And I said, can I write something for you about disabled students? They don't pay you. So they thought, well, why not? And that helped with networking, because it meant I could talk to people about the topic of the article. And that kind of, although I didn't have an office or position that identified me as a member of the sector or as a policy professional, by referencing those articles or those boards or working groups I was a part of, that helped give me an identity that I could use for the purposes of networking. And then the final part was, just apply for policy jobs, and I know that applying is a lot of work on its own, and there's a lot of luck involved in it. I got lucky and found a role at Policy Connect on assistive and accessible technology. So, and I used in that interview all of the things I've just talked about, because I was very aware that I'm probably going up against some people who did have some kind of more standard policy experience, where they could say that they'd done a 6-month internship or the like. But I felt that I knew the topic well enough that I could demonstrate some of my ability just by talking about the topic itself. And that is one sort of final tip I would suggest, is in the context of an interview, mostly what one's talking about is, these are my skills and so on. But you don't just have to tell people about your skills and experience. You can demonstrate it to some extent by talking about the subject itself and actually expressing an opinion about it. You probably don't want to express like the most wild or out there opinions, but by expressing some point of view about the policy area, that shows how much you've thought about it and how interested you are in the topic. I'm going to leave it there in terms of how I got into public policy. And again, people may have questions and go into that, but I thought I'd go on to the access to work part, and then we can kind of run all the questions together. Okay, so the government consultation on access to work, what I wanted to do was talk through a little bit about how I am approaching that consultation in the context of somebody who's working at a think tank. And in my view, there are more than one kind of legitimate way to approach a consultation, and it very much depends on what kind of organization you're representing. So for the most part, if you're representing an organization that is not a pure policy organization, it might be an organization within the sector or that has some interest. So let's say you're a supplier of technology as part of the access to work, or a supplier of coaching support. The most valuable input that you can give into that consultation is the input that is derived directly from your work. You can draw then on insights that other people who are responding to the consultation can't. And so it's really helpful to be able to distinguish your contribution. Obviously, there's going to be loads of contributions and lots of overlap, and that's not a problem, but you want to kind of make the core of your consultation drawn from your sort of particular and peculiar expertise as a as an organization or as an individual with the background and experiences that you have. In the context of a think tank, where we are drawing on our connections with various different organizations, we don't have to take exactly that approach. Another point about different organizations responding differently to consultations is I would make a distinction between kind of campaigning organization or a campaigning approach to a policy issue and a public policy or think tank type of approach. In the context of campaigning, and I'm not an expert in campaigning, so I'd be interested to hear others who've done some more of that work. But my sense of it is that one of the things that one's trying to do in campaigning is to mobilize non-policymakers, to mobilize stakeholders. So your audience, when you're crafting your recommendations or your demands, yes, it's partly the people in power, but it's also partly your sort of peers among the stakeholders. You want to get people feeling like they're part of a movement to push for those ideas. And so if you're campaigning, what you might do is you might make a recommendation that you don't think is going to be taken up. But you know it's going to generate energy and enthusiasm within your field of stakeholders. And then that in turn is going to create pressure on the government or whoever the decision maker is. And then maybe they'll move at least toward your position. In the context of a think tank, I think of the approach as a little bit different, where for the most part, the audience for the recommendation really is directly the policymaker. And therefore, one wants to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the policymakers' motivations for creating the consultation, what are the likely bounds of their decision making, meaning are they considering completely overhauling the program? Are they just looking for tweaks? What directions do you think they're currently leaning? And all of that is to understand what exactly is the opportunity for influence here, so that one doesn't make a recommendation that really has no hope of being taken on board by the policymakers in question. And to give you a little bit of an example of that, in the case of this access to work consultation, one can read comments that have been made by the relevant ministers, look at things that the Department for Work and Pensions has put out about access to work recently, look at the text of the consultation itself, and draw out, I think, a couple of clues as to why they are consulting and what are some of the ways that they may be leaning in terms of reforms to the program. Because although a consultation is supposed to be open, everybody has a bit of an opinion about what they think they might do, in spite of, even if they genuinely are listening to the sector as well as that. So I think that the context for the access to work consultation is very clearly, in large part, the increased cost of the program. For every program like access to work, it's helpful to think, what does it do for the people it helps? And what is the criteria by which it decides who it helps and who it doesn't? Or what is the way in which that support is rationed? And one way in which access to work has always been rationed in practice is that only a tiny fraction of people who are disabled people in the workplace actually apply for access to work to begin with. So it's sort of been rationed by lack of awareness, whether that's on purpose or that was just a sort of how things shook out, who's to say. But as awareness of access to work has grown since the pandemic, and that may have been because there was an awareness campaign that was conducted by the government, or it may have been that the circumstances of lockdown meant that more people were talking about the program. It may also be that there are simply more people who are recognizing themselves to be in need of the program. But some way or another, the number of people who apply for the program has gone up. It's also the case that of those people that apply for the program, more and more are receiving coaching support of various kinds. So this is sort of being coached to develop strategies to work in ways that suit that individual. And between more people using the program and an increase in the use of coaching support in particular, the costs of the program have gone up quite substantially, and they're projected, if current trends continue, that it'll really be a much bigger program by the end of the decade. So you can see that the government might be interested in trying to at least prevent the costs from going up further and maybe even reduce the cost of the program. Another bit of context that I thought was interesting from the text of the consultation is that the government points out that I think just over 1% or around 1% of disabled people in employment use access to work. And that hints at the idea of maybe they are interested in ideas that could reform the program such that more people used it. How do you square that with also wanting to reduce the costs or control the costs? Well, one can imagine a program where the per person cost is lower, but the number of people who receive it is higher. And somebody could argue that that overall creates a better impact because whilst it may be slightly less good for each person who gets it, if 2, 3, 4, 5 times as many people benefit, one can imagine an aggregate improvement. It's also helpful to think about what previous changes have happened to a program. So a change in the program that I think is interesting is that whilst for a long time civil servants who work in government departments have not been able to use access to work, apart from one small component that has to do with mental health, it's only more recently, I believe in 2013, that the government made it so that civil servants who work for non-departmental public bodies, organizations like Ofsted or the Office for Students, they also do not receive access to work, again, apart from one small component. So that makes me think maybe the government would be interested in ideas about even adding to that so that you create ever more types of organization that don't use access to work at all. That's one way to control costs, isn't it? That may be a good idea or a bad idea. But again, all of this is just trying to figure out what the motivation is, what are the types of ideas that may be of interest. The point is not to recommend to government what they're already thinking of. That would be pointless. But it's to see what direction they may be open to so that you can inform and influence in a sort of a steering type way. If you imagine the sort of analogy of a car or something that's headed down one direction, it's already kind of got momentum, and you can be part of helping to adjust the direction. That may not be as radical a change as one wants. I would suggest that that is partly how think tanks function. They tend not to be offering truly kind of socially transformational recommendations. They tend to be a bit more incrementalist. And I think inevitably a non-partisan think tank like Policy Connect is similarly going to be a bit more incrementalist than maybe some campaigning organizations. However, in my view, the scale of those smaller changes across the lives of the many people that are going to be impacted by a policy add up to something quite substantial. I think I'll end there, and either we'll go to questions or to my colleagues who are speaking. Amelia, you can direct us to what we should pick up next. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Robert. Am I right in thinking that you will be having to leave us?
I was going to, but I don't now, so that's great. I'll stick around.
Okay, great. Maybe if we are able to go to Clive now then, and then we could do questions for everyone at the end. That might make more sense if you're happy with that, Robert. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I would like to introduce Clive Gilbert, who is Robert's colleague at Policy Connect, who will be speaking to us about his experiences and his work. And we will be sharing an audio recording as part of this. So please just bear with us while we make sure that's set up correctly.
Hello, my name is Clive Gilbert. I'm the head of accessible transport at Policy Connect and work with Robert and Dennis in the accessibility team. I joined Policy Connect in 2019. Before then, I'd worked as a freelance researcher, advising mainly charities and local authorities about various aspects of disability. I graduated with an undergraduate degree in history from King's College London in 2008 and completed a part-time master's in public policy at University College London in 2012. My first proper work experience was organised through a mentor I'd met through a programme at King's, which aimed to support people from diverse backgrounds. In my case, this meant being a disabled person. At the time, I was interested in becoming a journalist, and I was assigned a mentor who worked at the BBC as a radio producer. He arranged for me to do an internship with the BBC, writing articles for the corporation's website. While I had a great time there, I found the writing I was doing a bit superficial in that the articles had to be churned out very quickly and didn't allow enough time to study issues in detail. This led me to become interested in the world of think tanks on the basis that you could write detailed reports on the big challenges facing UK society and the world. So I did a series of policy internships after graduating with my history degree from King's. The first internship I did was with a think tank called the New Local Government Network, which these days is called New Local. This was a really formative experience for me, partly because it confirmed that the world of think tanks and public policy could provide the kind of intellectual stimulation that I was looking for. It also introduced me to key policy areas that I still work on today. I had several more internships. Unfortunately, I found that while I was quite successful in securing short placements, it was much harder to get a permanent role, even after I'd completed my master's. I think that this was partly due to the job market, as I'd graduated just as the economy was about to enter recession following the 2008 financial crisis. But I also experienced quite a lot of discrimination in the form of inaccessible recruitment processes, offices that I couldn't get my wheelchair into, and ignorance and negative attitudes about disability. I had a couple of breakthroughs after my master's degree. The first was being offered a freelance research role working with a charitable trust that wanted to fund assistive technology at several third sector care providers. I was asked to produce a research report looking at how the care providers currently used ATech and advise on how they could do it better. After I submitted the report, the trust commissioned me to write a monthly newsletter on the latest developments in ATech, helping care providers and the wider world stay informed about the sector. I continued producing the newsletter for about 8 years. It's also how I first met Robert, who had become a subscriber. The other breakthrough was finding further freelance research work with some public sector consultancies, where I supported projects advising councils mostly about services used by disabled people, such as their social care provision. While these roles ultimately didn't develop into the career I wanted, I didn't receive enough projects to fill my time, They allowed me to build my knowledge of policy and develop skills and distinct areas of expertise that I was gradually becoming known for. In autumn 2018, Robert let me know about a job opening at Policy Connect for a policy manager focusing on a tech, and I joined the following January. I'll end my talk by telling you about the work I do now as Policy Connect's head of accessible transport. Until recently, our team focused almost exclusively on A-Tech. That changed in 2023 when Policy Connect became a partner in the National Centre for Accessible Transport, a new evidence centre dedicated to helping to make transport accessible throughout the UK through research. The centre is funded through a £20 million grant over a 7-year period by the Motability Foundation. The centre brings together organisations with expertise in inclusive product design, engineering, industry innovation and engagement, research and public policy. It works to shape the future of transport by ensuring that all future travel systems in the UK have accessibility for disabled people at the heart of both their creation and delivery. We do all of this in collaboration with our community of accessible transport. This is a growing community of over 2,500 members, the vast majority of whom are disabled people. It is open to anyone who shares our vision of a more accessible transport system and wishes to take part in our work. Of course, there is only so much good that research can do without a way of turning it into policy and practice. That's why we set up the Accessible Transport Policy Commission. Chaired by the former Paralympian Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson, the Commission is a cross-party group of parliamentarians that acts as a bridge between the centre and policymakers throughout the UK. The Commission holds meetings in Parliament to bring together disabled people, transport professionals and policymakers from the national, regional, local and devolved levels of government to improve public policies and everyday practices. In and around all of this activity, we hold lots of briefings with parliamentarians and government ministers and officials. We also work a lot with local government. One of the first reports that Policy Connect produced on behalf of the Centre looked at the role that local government staff play in making sure local transport services and infrastructure are accessible and how they can be better supported to fulfil their responsibilities to disabled residents. Last March, we also launched our Accessible Transport Charter, which local councillors and metro mayors can sign up to and commit to making transport more accessible in their areas. This is a very exciting project to be involved with. I'll close my talk there and look forward to taking part in the Q&A a bit later. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Clive. It's so interesting to hear about the contrast in routes into policy from yours and Robert's experience. And I think the main message I'm getting from that point of view is that there are many routes, and so hopefully that's kind of good to hear for people in the audience who maybe haven't got a that there's not one standard way to do it. So thank you so much, and we will come to questions at the end. But for now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Gurur Deniz Uyanık, who is a colleague again at Policy Connect, who will be speaking about their experiences and the work they do. So over to you.
Thank you, Amelia. Hi, everyone. I'm Deniz. My pronouns are they, she, and I have curly hair and a fringe. I'm wearing a black shirt, as I often do. I have glasses, a nose piercing, and I have an accent that reflects the fact that I've lived in Turkey most of my life, but also in England for the rest of it, and also Canada for a bit. So it's very mixed. And I'm a researcher at Policy Connect. For the last year, I've been working with Clive and Robert and mainly focusing on transport. And I also have a long route that I had into policy. I've only graduated 2 years ago, and I studied psychology and did a pathway, which was kind of like a minor in legal studies. So I didn't directly study policy, but understanding human behavior, how social change happens, and also understanding the legal systems that we're operating within, I think really prepared me well for the role I have now. And I also haven't done a master's, but instead what I did was a placement year in research. So I did social and political psychology research during my studies. And I also, briefly after graduation, worked with an MP for around 7 months. And I think having that work experience allowed me to learn about policy research without necessarily directly studying it. Alongside my current role, I also am a member of the Office for Students' Disability in Higher Education advisory panel. I will talk a bit more about that later, but I'm also a Disabled Students UK consultant. And all of my roles and experiences so far have allowed me to get an understanding of one another, and they've always been very connected. I want to talk a bit about how I became aware of accessibility work, disability work, not just policy, but also advocacy, campaigning, as well. I've also taken part in, as an attendee, many Disability Network, Disabled Leaders Network events as well. So it's nice to be presenting too. So when I started my studies, I think like a lot of people at university, I was also using the counseling service. And as someone from a different cultural background, I found a gap in the service in terms of how accessible it was and how diverse it was. And this led me to talk to a few of my peers, who then led me to the accessibility campaign at my university, which then allowed me to understand all the different areas in which universities can be made more accessible to disabled students. I also, through that process, learned a lot more about my own disabilities and what it means to be a neurodivergent person for myself. And I think being surrounded by other disabled people who are also very passionate about all the areas in which we're trying to improve really made me the person I am today. And it's really nice to be in a team that reflects that right now in a professional environment too. And within this campaign environment, we were just 3 to 6 people, depending on the year, but we were all quite determined to make the changes at our university, whether it was accessible and safer housing, hybrid learning following the lockdowns ending and a lot of disabled students losing access to their education, and also reasonable adjustments being more accessible. And all of these allowed me to really necessitated me to understand policy at a local level. So understanding the university's policies, how to approach senior leaders, how to gather the correct form of evidence by talking to staff members, whether it's professional staff or academic staff, students who are disabled or not disabled, those who might be against some of the positive changes because of their worries about what that might look like for them. And really allowed me to practice some of the things I do now as a policy researcher at a local level. And this was across many campaigns, but I think the more I learned and the more people I spoke to, the more passionate I became. And at no point did I realize that I accidentally, by taking on many roles like disabled students officer, accessibility student rep, going to NUS liberation conferences, doing part-time roles at the university, that I was accidentally creating a great CV for continuing this work after university. And I think that was really what allowed me to be able to do that, just doing it from a place of passion and not really thinking about what might come after, because when I started university, that wasn't what I had in my head. And I met really amazing people, not at university only, but also by getting involved with Disabled Students UK, by getting trained as a disabled student consultant. I was able to meet many other disabled students officers and reps and just campaigners across the country who also are now going into policy work as well. And really just thought about what the things we had been trying to improve had been looking like in other universities as well. And through my work in Disabled Students UK, one day I got offered to represent them at an event in Parliament. And this event was on blended learning, something I feel really passionately about. And this event was actually being run by Policy Connect. And I was really impressed and excited by how I was suddenly in a room getting to talk about something that I was almost begging senior leaders at my university to talk to us about. And we had people from different universities, vice chancellors, representatives from Russell Group. We had, you know, a peer who was a chair of the commission, and it was genuinely really fascinating as someone who had just graduated and working a temporary graduate job at university and really hadn't thought that what might immediately feel like it's a difficult thing because it's at a national level, so no one would be talking about it, right? Because at a local level, we're struggling. Actually, it's not impossible, and it was really, really nice to be in that room. So I naturally applied for a job at Policy Connect. And actually, because we're talking about indirect routes to policy, I didn't initially get the job I applied for, but like Robert said, I think talking to people, showing an interest in policy is really important because it was one of those situations where rejection was every direction. And with Robert's support, I actually managed to find a role in Parliament, working with an MP. And that really taught me what it is like in Parliament. And just like how I got to experience the lived experience side, the campaigner side at university, I then was able to understand a bit more the policymaker side. And after a while, I started working as a researcher in the accessibility team. And I really cannot imagine even drawing this picture for myself when I started university. And it really just happened by going to events that I cared about, going to being in rooms that I was really passionate to be in, wanting to represent people and just talking to anyone who was willing to talk to me. So there's really not a single way to get into policy work. And what I really like is that it's not one of those spaces where I feel like I need to dim my passion, but instead I actually can work with it. So that's been really nice. And another platform in which I am able to do this is within the Office for Students' Disability in Higher Education panel. And this panel is made up of 11 people who are both representatives from the Office for Students, but also different universities who are disability practitioners, students, those who have graduated like me as well. And we are within this group, we come together once every few months. It's been going on for 2 years now, and the Office for Students gives us the research they've been doing, whether it's the research objectives, the findings they've had, and we're able to give our insights around it. Similarly, with the aim of co-production, we're able to talk through some of the policy steps that they're hoping to make. And it's been really nice, again, being in a room, like I described, that that I saw in the blended learning event that Policy Connect ran. It was really nice to suddenly be in a room from people of various backgrounds who were passionate about similar things and seeing how we almost always agree on a variety of issues. So it is, I think, really important to constantly, even from university, just try to just talk and speak up about the things that you want to change. Because I think if it weren't for me, the person I was when I was going to student bars, telling people about this hybrid learning campaign we were running, and also going to all the pro-vice chancellors, still trying to have the same conversation. I don't think I could have been able to have the roles that I've had so far. And it genuinely has all been coming from a place of wanting to see that difference. I'm happy to also talk to anyone about my own experiences, or if anyone wants to share anything as well after this event too. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Denise. It's really interesting to hear. And just, I mean, I think something that's very, can you hear me? Am I, oh, okay, sorry, something flashed up on my screen. So, yeah, it's just really interesting also to hear the diverse policy areas that Policy Connect are working on, and all these different things that are happening and how it kind of interlinks, and you know, all the higher education and the accessible transport. It's also interesting, and I think many of our members will be very interested in wanting to pick all of your brains. So I guess I will move up to our next speaker now before going to questions. So next we're going to hear from a lovely Disabled Leaders Network member, Meander Nawati, who will be talking to us about her experiences influencing policy and kind of co-creation at a university level. So Meander, if you want to start.
Hi, apologies, Amelia. I can't seem to access the camera. Oh, okay, got a message to start my video at last. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Disaster avoided. Hi, everyone. I'm Meander. I'm a software engineering student in my final year at a university in London, where I'm also a class rep. I'm a Black woman with brown skin, wearing a green dress, black rimmed glasses with a brown filter. My hair is in brown braids. My pronouns are she, her, them. So I'm sharing my experience working on my university's access and participation plan, referring to that as the APP going forward. A little bit of history about the APP. Essentially, it's an agreement that all higher education providers are required to submit to the Office for Students, the OFS. And the APP details the strategies that will be used to support equality of opportunity within the student body. So, for example, there are explicit commitments made to provide a hardship fund, or mental health services, or disability bursaries. The student groups targeted by these plans are identified by characteristics such as economic status, race, disability, English as a second language, and age. So, for example, at my uni, due to the makeup of the student body, students who fall into the age bracket of 21 to 25 years old are a key niche group targeted by the APP. Higher education providers are monitored by the OFS in a number of quality metrics. One of these is the continuation and completion rates. And students who are in these APP groups provide a significant data point for that monitoring. APP plans have a shelf life of 4 years. They're meant to be a living document, but previous plans have been submitted, and then interventions and strategies just promptly forgotten about. Last year, the OFS added a new element to the submission process by requiring an independent student statement that is meant to be a reflection on the APP process, and or a commentary on the plan itself. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the development process at my university. A bunch of senior reps were invited to form a working group and participate in designing the new APP agreement. we've been asked to share student perspectives that would inform the interventions and strategies created to support our peers and colleagues. Being a disabled student who had raised a number of disability complaints at the university, the request to me was to bring that perspective to the process. I suppose I imagined that I would attend a round of meetings working on developing strategies. However, some months after our working group was set up, we were actually presented with a completed draft. And that's, having made no contribution to the policy design at all. And in a somewhat back to front way, the college then went about gathering data and insights through the use of focus groups and surveys across the target demographics. So there was a real lack of engagement at the design stage. And in my opinion, the APP reflects this. And our student statement from the working group comments, for example, on new disability interventions that will actually reduce certainty for disabled students by limiting access to support funds. Although many of the interventions are viewed positively, the exclusion of any improvements to the student services delivering them is considered disappointing by the working group. As a rep, I can confirm that the majority of frustrations faced by my colleagues and students tend to stem from student services, interactions with student services. So that's either, from unwieldy processes that are a challenge to navigate, or communication breakdowns with specific service delivery teams. So what's great about the APP? Well, the OFS intention with these strategies, is to create value for students and smoothen the experience of being in higher education so that students can continue to progress along their degree pathways. But the lack of student involvement in the design process at my university is definitely a missed opportunity to make interventions meaningful and effective. When we consider the APP, it's interesting to think about who benefits. The survey data from these focus groups revealed 40% of students didn't believe that the strategies were achievable. And seemingly, the APP plan, for this reason, seemingly the APP plan benefits the college by completing a governance task, but real improvement and support for students is doubtful. What would have been even better for this process, on reflection, would be if the college were to provide platforms for a wide range of voices to be heard, by really committing to regular engagement so that we set up really trustworthy feedback loops. I would like to have seen more value placed on the working group students. Being students, with a student workload, to have the process be respectful of time pressures, exam weeks, assignment weeks, have awareness of what the student contribution means in the context of being a student, and remunerate people for all of their efforts, time, energy, ideas, and attention. And finally, to treat the process as an opportunity to create a learning experience for the students who are involved. So, I would say that exposure to policy design was a novel experience for everybody in the working group. It can be really formative for people developing their skills, and also influential on career choices. So there's a real positive from nurturing this in students who are already clearly engaged. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meander. Thank you so much. It's really useful to hear your perspective and to understand kind of your ideas for what co-creation could look like if it worked well and to be genuinely meaningful. So thank you really, really much. I think we have sort of reached the end of our session time, but I think we could take just 5 more minutes. Robert, I don't know if you kind of wanted to, I don't know if you've seen some of the questions. I think there's some very specific, but there's some very much about kind of how we influence policy in general, if we're not in kind of formal structures. So I guess I don't know if there's one in particular you'd like to answer, or if you want to kind of wrap up an answer to a few of the questions, or if you have a colleague that, if you think someone else might be better placed.
Yeah, you said there's loads of questions. So I'm trying to think what's the best way. I guess I can respond to a couple, and then maybe we can kind of follow up with ones that we don't get to here. One person asks, with regard to access to work, how do you think, sorry, not a great reader, how do you think when writing policy, you can explain the waiting time? So there's a question about how access to work has long waiting times, so reading around the consultation, this is something that the government's acknowledged and the previous government acknowledged as well. So that's important context when we're thinking about response. The government responded to the fact of long waiting times by employing some more people in the Department for Work and Pensions. And for whatever reason, that hasn't fully resolved the issue. So I think one of the things that one might want to think about is, okay, do they need to employ even more people, or is there something about the whole process and design of the program that just creates too much work on the government side, and could it be made less time consuming? I think they're somewhat difficult questions, because one of the ideas that I think some people have had is that there should be better sort of case management to reduce the burden on the person applying for access to work in terms of administration and just having somebody you can go to. And if each case was case managed, that would create even more work to do for the government. So it's there's things pulling in both directions there, and one, you can have sort of bad answers to good questions. So one response to the wait times would be to really remove the kind of bespoke aspect of access to work. So everybody kind of gets a really similar thing. That would maybe speed things up, but would that be an improvement? Yeah, quite a bit there to sort of chew on, I suppose.
I think one of the key kind of questions, I guess, for our audience is maybe, especially if there's students and people who aren't necessarily in a position yet to kind of be in those influential positions, kind of what influence can they have? Obviously, we know we can do a response to a green paper, but are there other ways you would recommend to kind of influence policy?
Yeah, so I think that a good thing to do is see who else is already involved in trying to influence that policy, and see how you can get involved with them in those initiatives. So, for example, there's something called the Access to Work Collective that's been established, and you can sort of ask to join on LinkedIn. Perhaps we could share the details of that after this call. And I joined their first kind of meeting, and it was really interesting. And they're keen to kind of gather and synthesize people's views on access to work, so that they can make representations to government as a group.
Yeah, that sounds great. I've just added that into the chat. And I guess the final question would kind of be from in terms of the getting into policy side of things, how to sort of approach that networking piece, I guess, in the first instance, if you either are just nervous about it, or if, you know, in terms of barriers from your disability, and kind of how, especially if you have an energy limiting disability, kind of if you just have any advice for that.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts, and these by no means kind of solve the issue, and it's clearly something that the policy sector itself needs to be looking at, not just putting it all on individuals. But from the individual's point of view, a couple of things. One is, going to something with the intention to network does not mean staying the whole time. Nobody minds or is interested, you know, for the most part, how long you're there, if it's a conference or something like that. So it's not like I'm doing networking properly if I'm kind of spending a lot of time doing it. You know, talking to one or two people, that can be, you know, that can be more useful than kind of wiping yourself out by having, you know, sort of hitting loads and loads of individuals. A more general point, I would say, is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, whilst there are organizations like think tanks that are kind of pure policy, policy is kind of always, even when a think tank engages in it, an aspect of another sector, right? So there's like the health sector, but within that, there might be the sort of, I don't know, the cancer treatment sector, or there might be the kind of you know, arts and culture or promotion of theatre sector, and each of those have a policy aspect. So networking for the purposes of policy doesn't mean going to events and talking to organizations that necessarily have the word policy in their title. It could be, you know, a some kind of public meeting that's been set up by Arts England to find out what young people think about arts. But actually, that's where you're going to meet people who are interested in arts policy, or at least you can tell people you are, and then you'll get directed to the right people. And that's one thing as well. Finally, if you speak to somebody and you're able to just kind of clearly lay out what you're interested in, then very often, even if that's not something that they work on, they will know somebody, and that's a really useful thing that they can do for you, is put you in contact with somebody else.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, and I really like that idea of finding the people kind of where you are, what you're interested in. Then that's probably a really good route, and that you don't have to kind of overdo it. So thank you so much, Robert, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm really sorry that we haven't got time to answer any more questions on the call now, but what we will do is we will share the questions with our panelists afterwards, and if they have any kind of if they feel they can answer any of them, we will then send out their answers in an email. So hopefully, if you've asked a question, you will get it answered. But thank you so much to Robert, Clive, Deniz and Meander for giving up their time today, and to our access providers. We will be opening applications for the Disabled Leaders Network this summer, so please do keep an eye out on our newsletter, and we'll let you know when applications open if you would like to join, because we have many conversations like this about various topics, and you would be very welcome to join. So if you're a DLN member, we will be moving over to our private discussion call after this on the separate link. So please do join us there. If not, I hope you will join us at our next public event, or you will consider applying to join the Disabled Leaders Network. But thank you so much again to our speakers and to everyone for joining us today. Thank you. Bye.